Okay, despite all those silver bullets that I've talked to you about, we still have 6,500,000 students with learning disabilities across the United States. So all these years that we have fooled around with these component parts, we still have these students who can't read. And unfortunately, we spend between 70 and 80 or maybe more now $billion primarily to teach children to read because those children are placed in special ed. And what the third one says there is that 80 to 90% of the children that are in special education are there because they can't read. So you can say to yourself that this $80 billion is really there because of some failure in our system to teach children to read. Have you got it? All right. What this one says is that 38% of our nation's fourth graders, that's 38%, cannot read at a basic level. So again, all the things that we fooled around with have not provided us with what we need to do for these students. And unfortunately, in many low-income urban districts, that number approaches 70%. So what happens then, if you have 70% of those children unable to read, going through that pipeline of kindergarten through 12th grade, what do you think is going to happen to those children in 9, 10, 11th grade? What do you think they're going to do? If 70% of the 70% that can't read, what do you think they're going to do? They're probably going to drop out. That's right. And if they drop out, which way are they going? They're certainly not going on to more education. They may or may not get a good job, but unfortunately, too many of them may be heading toward some incarceration, because we know that the population incarcerated population are highly illiterate. So here's what we're going to do for today. I'm going to talk to you about a theory of cognition, because if I take you back to that first slide, what we talked about is that processing language is a cognitive act, therefore we need to have instructions based on a theory of cognition. You guys all with me? So this is the theory of cognition that you're going to learn about today, and that's called dual coding theory. And dual coding theory is an interplay between verbal and nonverbal codes. And the nonverbal code that we're going to talk a lot about today is imagery. So you can answer this question: what's the nonverbal code? Imagery. So what dual coding theory is talking about is an interplay or integration between those two. Now, if you're reading, what code are you using? Largely, is that a verbal code or a nonverbal code? It's a verbal code. That's language. Okay? So that's the verbal code. The other thing that we're going to talk about today is what are the two types of imagery that underlie language and literacy skills. If this is the theory of cognition that we want to go to, dual coding theory, then there's two types of imagery that I'm going to be talking to you about for that interplay of verbal and nonverbal codes. And what sensory input underlies comprehension is really one of the most important things I'm going to be talking to you about today, because if you think about the field of reading and their focus on word recognition or word attack skills, finally after really a very long time, we concluded that there's sensory input that you need in order to be able to read and spell. So a dyslexic student will have difficulty at the sensory level, not at the IQ level, in reading and spelling words. And we think that we have figured out that it's primarily phonological awareness, and I'm adding to it imagery, but we have not identified, up until what I'm talking to you about, really a sensory input that underlies language comprehension. Then another issue that we're going to try to solve today is there a separate comprehension weakness? When I'm speaking at conferences, or if you're attending a conference on reading, someone at that conference can make a presentation that the only reason that you can have a reading comprehension problem would be because you either can't read the words or you don't read the words fast enough. And there's no question that if you read too slow, you are going to have difficulty comprehending. There's no question that if you don't read the words accurately, you could have difficulty comprehending. They'll also say that the primary contribution, another primary contribution to weakness in reading comprehension is going to be weak oral vocabulary, and there's no question about that either. You can have, if you have weak oral vocabulary, you're going to have difficulty understanding what you're reading. But what I'm posing to you is, could there be something separate from all of those that happens to individuals that are having difficulty with reading comprehension? Another thing that I want you all to raise your hand about, if you know about this, do you all know, if you know what this means, raise your hand. Do you know what hyperlexia is? I can't see all of you out there, so, but I hope that you're playing along with me. If I say, how many of you have heard of or know what dyslexia is? Raise your hand for that. Yes, most everybody is going to raise their hand for that. Not very many people are going to raise their hand for hyperlexia. How many of you know or think you know about autism? 5 years ago, hardly anybody would have raised their hand about that. But as you saw from the music video that I played, now that's 1 in 150 children will be diagnosed with autism. And so it has raised its head in our awareness. The last thing is, what does the research show when dual coding theory is applied to the development of language processing skills? The next slide that you should have up there is sensory input needed for cognition. So everything that we're going to be talking about is related to how we are able to teach cognition. And this is a brain scientist named Carl Pribram, and he makes kind of a convoluted statement, by the way, but I'm going to try to unravel it for you. Pribram says we cannot think about something of which we are not consciously aware. So he's talking about thinking in consciousness. And we cannot be aware of something not perceived sufficiently at the sensory level. So you can think of sensory input brought to consciousness to help us be able to think and comprehend. So what I'm going to be talking to you about is bringing sensory input to consciousness for language processing. Now these, you should have up sensory cognitive functions and reading. The amount of sensory processing available to a child is a primary factor in learning to read. So if I had the time, I would take you back to the slide that said that we have all these challenges. We have, if you can recall, how many children that cannot read in this country. 38% of the fourth graders cannot read. And that has something to do with their amount of sensory processing that they're not bringing to the task. This part of the slide says that sensory cognitive factors can be identified, they can be stimulated, and they can be applied to facilitate language and literacy development. So if I bring you back to the circles, that means that sensory information can be brought in for word attack and word recognition. It can be brought in for contextual reading for fluency, and it can be brought in for comprehension. Your test at the end of the day before you get to leave the room is, can you draw that Venn diagram and put in the component parts? The sensory cognitive function of mental imagery is related to competency in language and literacy skills, and that's relatively new. It's new for the field of reading. It's not new for the field of cognition.